Where do I even start? First of all, this won't be the usual winners and losers video that I normally do on this channel. This will be more of like a post-Belgian Grand Prix discussion, so feel free to leave any thoughts you have down in the comments below. But for me, I'm just baffed at everything that happened, and by everything, I mean nothing. For us as fans, it was extremely disappointing, especially for those who actually paid for tickets to go to the circuits, only to get soaking wet in the freezing cold weather for 8 hours straight. After the 4-week summer break, we were all excited for the season to restart, given the intensity of the championship battle, and it seemed as though we were in for an absolute thriller after a wild qualifying session on Saturday. But it ended up being one massive anticlimax. It was delay after delay after delay until they decided to suspend the race for good. But even after all that waiting, the only bit of racing we got was 2 laps under the safety car, just so there would be a classification. And that was that. Max Verstappen took his 6th victory of the season, George Russell took the first podium of his career, and Nikita Mazepin bagged the fastest lap. Now, the FIA no doubt made the right decision to call it off. The conditions were simply too unsafe for racing to take place. I mean, visibility was basically non-existent, and the cars were even aquaplaning on the straights. But it was frustrating for those at the circuit who didn't get their money's worth, for people living in areas where races are broadcast at very early times, and for those who spend their afternoon or evening staring at rain on a screen for hours on end. At the end of the day though, I think we'd all rather the drivers be safe than allow them to race and an incident to happen, especially considering the number of accidents we saw at Radion throughout the weekend. The weather basically ruined what could have been a fantastic show for everyone. Having said all that though, I'm still going to touch upon a few highlights and lowlights from the weekend as a whole, starting with none other than George Russell. P2 in a Williams. Let that sink in for a minute. Yes, the circumstances may have gifted him the podium, but he still performed phenomenally well to stick his car on the front row in qualifying. And if you weren't convinced that George is a generational talent before, then you surely should have changed your mind after that performance. Rain is said to be the best way of leveling the playing field in F1, and often, if not always, the cream rises to the top. With all the speculation about whether he'd be in the Mercedes for next year, George just kept his head down and delivered one of, if not the best lap of the season. Someone who didn't have a particularly memorable qualifying session was Lando Norris. Thankfully, he was able to get out of the car without any major injuries after a hefty shunt at Radion. At that point, the conditions had become too dangerous for drivers to set any timed laps, and Lando unfortunately found himself at the wrong place at the wrong time. Even Seb told his team over the radio that the track was too wet, and soon after, he was told that Norris was in the wall. And with Seb being the absolute champ that he is, then stopped to check if the Brit was okay. However, it was gutting to see Lando go out like that after showing so much promise in the previous rounds. It well could have been him standing on the top step, but unfortunately, it wasn't to be this time around. Checo on his outlap to the grid ended up in the wall, but it didn't really mean too much other than 3 points being lost. But apart from that, there's not too much else to talk about. The drivers who did the job in quali and simply kept it on track on Sunday ended up scoring points. But should we really be awarding points for just 1 lap of racing under the safety car? I personally don't think so. But at the end of the day, the stewards are the ones who make the decisions. I apologize for this video being as short as it is. I really was looking forward to covering a race where we actually had some action to talk about, but sadly, we didn't get any. Hopefully next week's race in Zandvoort will provide a much better spectacle than the one today, and we never have to experience something like that ever again.